When we think of game genres, we typically think of the main headings: action, adventure, RPG, strategy, simulation, etc. This was all well and good when we had far fewer games and thus far fewer niches. However, as time has passed, new genres have been birthed and old genres have been reignited. Now we can look back in retrospect at older titles. We can capture the evolution of genre in the video game industry over time. For example, the first titles to exist were arcade games. Arcade cabinets were the main way to source video games, and they provided a certain set of constraints and functionality that defined the genre that came out of them. They were typically brief, score-based, and required only a few buttons. We still see these today, however, they were soon overshadowed by the introduction of home gaming consoles. This led to larger titles that could have stories and extended campaigns. Over time, genre evolved, as it does with any new medium, and we saw video games become so much more than their humble origins. Home computers became more capable, leading to an entirely new market that had far more buttons to play with, along with the accuracy of a mouse. Then a whole lot more innovation happened, which pretty much takes us to today, where you're watching this video about the newest game genre. And you probably know what this genre is, but you might not know why this genre is so important and what it tells us about the future of gaming. The bullet heaven genre had very humble beginnings. Released in 2019, developer Lamey probably had no clue that their game would lead to one of the biggest modern innovations in gaming. That game was Magic Survival. In this, you would upgrade and find various artifacts and talents that would quickly turn your screen from a simple bullet hell to the absolute chaos we all know and love today. Inspired by this game, developer Ponkel aimed to create a game that he could easily add tons of content to without becoming burdened by mechanic implementation and other factors that hinder development time and innovation. With a simple framework, he got to work with his first product. I recommend watching this video by NoClip that interviews the developer and discusses the trials and tribulations he faced getting into game development if you are interested in the journey. To cut a long story short, Vampire Survivors absolutely exploded in popularity. It featured on many notable streams and YouTube channels, and the low price made it a relatively frictionless purchase for the vast majority of people. Additionally, it released at a similar time to the release of Valve's Steam Deck, which was perfect for the simple gameplay. According to rough estimates, the game has sold about 7 million copies to date, and remains firmly in the top 300 selling games on Steam, competing with AAA behemoths. Obviously, this enormous success for a single developer was incredibly enticing, especially due to the ostensible ease of creating a Vampire Survivors lookalike. Despite the development craze that ensued, we are now only left with a few remnants of the time that managed to break through and see similar success. Some notable titles are Brotato, Soulstone Survivors, and 20 Minutes Till Dawn. Many other titles saw relatively minor success, like Bone Razor Minions, Rogue Janisha, and Bounty of One. Still a huge hit for a single developer, but they pale in comparison to Vampire Survivors. And left in the dust are the likely tens or hundreds of bullet heaven games that failed to innovate, took too long, or didn't catch players' eyes. Although the hype is relatively subdued now, quickened by the oversaturation due to the genre's simplicity, new games are still releasing following a similar formula, and it's likely that they'll remain relatively stable. And so we are left with the bullet heaven genre. Games in this genre will form a general formula. Players will be able to move around a large terrain, oftentimes without the ability to aim, but a few exceptions, and kill large mobs of similar enemies. Enemies will drop experience points for the player to collect and level up. On level up, they will be greeted with the opportunity to select one or more upgrades, normally with very little immediate effect. However, with time, these abilities will snowball into huge player power. These games also have meta progression to keep each run feeling somewhat varied. Keep in mind, a lot of these factors can change per game, but you will always have that wave or time-based gameplay, with players simply beating off hordes of enemies. So why does this genre work? In all honesty, it seems kind of boring, but there's something about it that just... It's a well-known fact that 90% of gamblers quit right before their big win. What's lesser known is the fact that 90% of Vampire Survivors players quit right before getting their 5-piece chest. Gambling has naturally been a part of gaming in some form ever since its inception. The first arcade cabinets had kids lined up all around the block with 20-cent pieces, ready to do everything they could to make it to the top of that leaderboard. Granted, it isn't quite the same thing, but that addiction to spend money for just one more try is most definitely the infamous gambler's mindset. Cut to now, where we have loot boxes, lots of flashing lights, lots of random number generation, and also just tons of gambling video games. It's now at the point where the stimulation of these poker machines tactics are a necessity in titles deemed game juice, for having that inexplicable feeling of satisfaction and reward with each button press and player action. That incredible satisfaction of receiving a chest is almost synonymous with getting a big win from a poker machine. Indeed, Ponkel himself worked in gambling companies prior and during the development of Vampire Survivors, and he was well aware of the ways in which gambling drew players in and kept sucking their money from them. The items moving in quick succession mimics the spinning slots of a machine, as do the bright flashing lights and fireworks of a win. All of that movement and opportunity stimulates the dopamine receptors in our ooga booga brains, virtually rewarding us for a completely random event. This is what causes people to become horribly addicted to gambling, losing their life savings on these malevolent machines. And similarly, it's what causes people to keep coming back to Vampire Survivors, because it satiates that crave without the requirement of spending thousands of dollars. And that design philosophy of making the player feel rewarded for getting a lucky chest extends into general gameplay. The sound effects might seem simple enough, but that constant hitting noise sounds very similar to hitting a switch or clicking a button. Even that is enough to keep players enthralled just because everything feels so good to do. And a game that goes even further to add more game juice is Snake RX. Here we see the immensely satisfying gameplay with the addition of springs. Springs are absolutely integral to modern games because they again stimulate those reward receptors. Springs are what makes things bounce around, whether that be buttons, platform characters, or any other UI or gameplay element. Paired with this, we also have particles. Particle effects, when used correctly, can add so much more tangibility to each action, where not only do buttons bounce around when hovered and clicked, but they also expel satisfying little shapes that drift around as remnants of us smashing that button. Very similar to that like button beneath this video. Go ahead, try it. The subscribe button does honestly need a little bit of work though, but I'd still recommend trying that one too just for a cheeky comparison. Additionally is screen shake. This is that big rumble you get when something happens on the screen, like the player firing a bullet or an explosion going off. Rumbling the screen has a similar effect to the rumble on a controller. It makes the world feel more vibrant, alive, and active. All of this is immensely satisfying, and it's why Snake RX managed to capture such a large player base despite its minimal veneer. It also has another element taken from auto-battler gameplay that certainly adds to the gambling aesthetic. Similar to Brotato, your additional player upgrades do not come in one pop-up screen with 3 options, but instead you have a currency that persists between rounds that you can use to purchase upgrades such as new weapons or new stat alterations. That role of the shop is very RNG based, and it simultaneously creates a unique experience with every run, but adds in far more player agency through more incorporation of traditional gambling elements. Rolling the shop feels very satisfying, perhaps less so in Brotato and more so in Snake RX and Super Auto Pets. And all of these incorporations of gambling elements kind of begs the question if it's actually ethical to use these techniques that have ruined so many lives in the past. My immediate reaction was, you're not losing heaps of money, you're paying often less than $5 for these games that offer the same satisfaction. What you are losing, however, is time. Thinking about that does slightly sound more sinister, considering that these games, and indeed all games, are most definitely striving to keep you hooked for as long as possible. However, I think just because it is completely single player and contains no monetary rewards or purchases outside the initial price, means that they can get away with using these exploitative tactics to elevate their gameplay, rather than compromise their integrity. This problem of gambling methodology in gaming is far more prevalent in competitive gaming and games with cosmetics, because they can beg people, especially children, to waste away hundreds of hours. But that's probably a topic for another video, and likely one that already exists. So, all things considered, the use of gambling functions is ultimately for the benefit of this genre, because without that over-the-top stimulation reward, players simply won't come back for the gameplay. And it's how games can use this methodology to distinguish themselves that defines breakout hits. It all comes down to innovation. Innovation in any genre is a necessity in any medium. It's what drives sales, critical acclaim, and long-term impact. Some huge titles can get away with relatively little innovation because they instead provide familiarity for players. However, for indie developers, they don't have the luxury of an established fanbase. This is why the bullet heaven genre became oversaturated so quickly. It was so easy for a developer to make a decent replicant of Vampire Survivors, and due to the novelty of the genre, they could potentially be one of the first games to do so, and have a piece of the pie. We don't often see genres explode so quickly. In fact, I don't think we ever have. And what inevitably happened is that in a sea of Vampire Survivors lookalikes, games were lost in Steam due to their lack of ingenuity. So it became clear that new games must bring something new to the table, either in terms of aesthetic, polish, or gameplay. That's exactly what happened. Bounty of One added multiplayer, Brotato added far more characters and the system for a more diverse item pool, 20 Minutes Till Dawn added the ability to manually aim along with lots of weapon choices, Bone Razor Minions completely changed the style by making the player utterly powerless. The immediate innovation in the genre seemingly saw no bounds, and successful developers were consciously attempting not to rip off their inspiration, rather take it and shape it into something new and unique. And what is so novel about this genre is that its core gameplay is actually not that fun. It's literally just walking around, normally pretty slowly, attacking the same enemies and experiencing the same tedium. Unlike an FPS where there is inherent enjoyment in the core gameplay of shooting guns and taking down other players, in bullet heaven games it's incredibly bare bones. And now the initial rush has passed us, we are seeing many of these games that are proving that the core gameplay is good, but seldom noteworthy in isolation. And with this, it's certainly troubling to consider it might have just been a phase that's left us with a few standout titles and not much else. To some extent, it will remain this way, because it has again become quite a niche market with newer titles seeing little success in comparison. But it's important to remember that little success, say less than 500 reviews on Steam, can still result in a fair amount of money for the developer. A big recent success was Halls of Torment. It had a nostalgic old-school aesthetic with a unique equipment system to collect new items. That innovation, that deviation from the norm, is what made it thrive. Compare that to Gunsuit Guardians. Both undoubtedly good games, however, one is simply newer than the other, and I predict Gunsuit Guardians will be unable to establish any larger of a player base than it has now. Halls of Torment clearly showed the world that the bullet heaven genre was not over yet, and there are still far more iterations on it that people can create. However, it almost feels like we're witnessing an accelerated birth and fade out, and it's most definitely a testament to the importance of innovation. Because without it, the market becomes so oversaturated that people will just lose interest. And thus, we have discovered the newest genre, a genre founded on simple foundations and a genre that requires major innovation to stay afloat. Indeed, the gambling techniques will inevitably be adopted by new indie developers wanting to make gameplay not only engaging, but addictive. Not only will the bullet heaven genre remain a notable point in video game history, but it will influence many other games to come by encouraging simple foundations with lots of player agency. Your game doesn't need a story, it doesn't need impeccable art, but it does need to be fun, and it does need to hook players by the eyes. Fun games have good gameplay, successful games have addictive gameplay, and never in a genre has it been more apparent than in the newest video game genre, the bullet heaven. Thank you all for watching. Pretty blown away by the reception of the previous video. Please do stick around and see what I've got in store next. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and take care. See ya.